what I did. So the morning was ruled by, number one, total obscurity, right? Getting lost, going down weird, obscure dirt roads, going up to this weird, finding this obscure house, not find the front door is obscure, walking past nothing was like real obvious. And that combined with mild level of humiliation or embarrassment for having my blankie with me, and nothing's really explained. Just, you can take your shoes off there. Anyway, the morning continued and we meditated and we did everything that I did there over the next 13, 14 years. And what I didn't know at the time was that I was actually, in a way, in a very profound way, I was being initiated into a certain lineage. I didn't know that because I thought initiations were like, formal sort of ceremonies and, gurus tapping their students on their heads and their crown chakras exploding or, God knows what. I didn't even think that far at the beginning. I just thought it was kind of a confusing, strange morning. Only years later many years later did I begin to understand actually what was happening. But the obscurity, the hiddenness, the lack of exterior forms. The only exterior form there was those cushions in that living room, was actually part of a certain type of lineage. Now, fast forward years later, when I had got to know this middle-aged lady named Arvis. And after some years, I thought, I would really like to do one of those, like real serious Zen retreats that you read about in books, those sashins, and they just sound very intriguing and mysterious and, lovely. And I'd read books on them. And Arvis had talked about doing them. And, so I asked her, do you know anywhere where I can do one of these sashins, one of these retreats? And she said, well, I've heard of this guy. I've met this guy up in this area, and I think I met him and I trust him pretty well, so he'd probably be pretty good to go see. And that's as much as she told me. So I found it and I wrote to them. You couldn't go on a website; they didn't have one, and they wrote me back and the whole thing. And next thing I know, I'm up at this retreat. Now the retreat. Now this is Zen. Up in the mountains. It is foggy. There's a temple bell, a big temple bell. There's a beautifully robe-clad monk, getting ready to ring the bell, and there's a beautiful, meditation hall, absolutely gorgeous, hardwood floors, beautiful Buddha figures. Almost everybody in there was in some of these beautiful black robes, except me, which once again kind of feeling a little bit like when I had the blankie under my arm, like, okay, who's the rank amateur in this room? It was me. So I go there and I do. And I've talked about briefly that retreat and how difficult that was. And few years later, for various reasons, because of what we had talked about, the teacher up at this particular place, I told them that I was interested in becoming a monk because I thought if you if you want to be enlightened, you got to become a monk. It just seemed like every enlightened guy in the Zen tradition seemed to be some monk, except for layman Pang. Layman Pang was this layman, which I found is like a dirty word among monks, layman. You're such a layman, But layman Pang was very, very highly regarded. In fact, in the tradition, there's all these stories of layman Pang basically dancing circles around the Zen masters in his responses and his clarity. But nonetheless, so I thought, well, I guess if I want to become enlightened, then I got to become a monk. And I had expressed some mild interest in this thing, but this teacher had a temple, and people looked like monks and were dressed like monks often, but they weren't actually any monks. He was a monk, he was a priest, he was a Zen master, he was all that, but it didn't seem like he was doing the monk thing. He had a temple, not a monastery and all that, and I sort of was talking to him about this, and he just sort of very casually said, well, why don't you become my first monk? And I kind of... I thought we were just talking about it, And of course, one of the first things I thought that I didn't express was, why me? I'm just like some 23-year-old doofus. I don't even have a robe. Everybody else has a robe, So I was actually kind of taken aback. I thought, well, that's really great. I mean, I just said what I thought I wanted and was given it on a silver platter. And then, of course, I thought, well, why me? You know what? I mean, was it just because I asked? Or I didn't even ask to become one. I just expressed some interest. So I don't know why me. I still don't know why me. Not that it matters anymore, but the long and the short of it is, obviously I didn't end up becoming a monk. I did spend times at various Zen monasteries and other areas over the years, but I never ended up becoming a monk. For years, I'd had a premonition that I was going to be dead by the time I was 25. Or sometime in the 25th year, I was going to die. And it was one of those premonitions that you kind of feel you absolutely know is true. But the odd thing was, I never stayed awake at night thinking about it or worrying about it. I never had a slightest twang of fear, of apprehension, of regret. It was just sort of some fact. You will be dead on your 25th year. And it didn't seem strange at the time. Only in retrospect did it seem strange to have such a premonition and be so certain about it, but have no feeling about it whatsoever. No, like I said, no fear, no nothing. Well, the 25th year was actually the year that I had my first awakening. It didn't end up to be the death that I thought. I thought I was in for the physical kind. But this one was actually much more real and substantial than the physical kind, which isn't important to explain, really. One has to find out for themselves. Now, at that moment, at 25, there was most definitely a death. And there was a certain awakening. And fortunately, my teacher told me two things. Very, very good. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. You're 50% there. Really wonderful thing. Wonderful? Good? You've seen truth? Lovely? 50% of truth. And then I was told, you've seen that form is emptiness, but you have not seen that emptiness is form. Of course, I was 50% awake, so I didn't know what the hell that meant. I did know what it meant that form was emptiness, but I didn't know the other side of the coin. So years later, 7, maybe 8 years later, another moment of clarity. Let's call it just a moment of clarity rather than some big word. Another moment of clarity. I got the other half. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. One of the first things I said to, in fact, the first thing I said to my teacher when we did talk about it, because we didn't talk about it for quite a long time, a couple months, I had no impulse to say anything to her about it. It was like there was just no reason that anybody really needed to know. And it was odd in retrospect. I thought, well, I mean, that's what she's there, so she probably would. That's the only reason I ended up talking to her about it, because it occurred to me after a few months, well, that's what she's doing. I mean, she might actually like to know. So I kind of did it out of a sense of obligation. Like, she should probably like to know something that's happened. But the funny thing was, it was so, in one sense, self-contained. It didn't need anything from the outside. It didn't need approval. It didn't need handshaking, well done, slap on the back. It didn't need anything. It was so obvious, so ridiculously present, so unimaginably what it was, that there was no need to have anybody say anything about it. But after a few months, I thought she might like to know. So I was talking to her and describing what, not just what had happened, but what was seen. What was seen was more important and relevant than what had happened. And very early in our conversation, I said to her, and this is the thing that I was a bit apprehensive about saying, but I knew that it was true, so I had to. And I said, this is bigger than Zen, isn't it? And she looked at me and she said, yes, it is. And I didn't even know it at the time. I don't know if she knew it. Because things can happen that are very significant and powerful without you even knowing it. In fact, I would say the things that are most significant and most powerful are the things that you don't even know are happening. But only in retrospect, years later, did I realize that what had occurred on one level is there was realization. That was simple enough, that was obvious enough, but it didn't end up to be like I thought it would. I didn't imagine that it would sort of take me out of the tradition I was in. In essence, it took me out of the lineage of tradition. What I didn't know is that it actually took me into the lineage of my teacher. You would think my teacher was a Zen teacher. She would even call herself as such. She may or may have not even thought of herself as such. I don't know. We never talked about it. But she had the Zen cushions. I mean, hell, most of the robes that people go wear in Zen temples now in America, guess who came up with a design for them? She did. She got one of those robes on a trip to Japan. She brought it back. She made a pattern out of it. And that's where most of all these black robes you see Zen Buddhists wearing, that's where they come from. That was the first sort of pattern right, that was made, although she didn't wear them. She used to. I mean, hell, she sewed them and made them available for people in the very, very early times, but she no longer wore them. She was very much of a Zen teacher in a sense. The form, the chanting, everything. The form we followed in her little house was the same as they followed in any temple I ever went to. And yet, there was a whole different lineage happening. Most of the lineages we know are lineages that are rooted in time. Someone somewhere has a realization. They awaken from the dream of mind. And they decide to root that in the world of time. And that's the beginning of a tradition. Maybe the person themselves doesn't even try to root it in time, but eventually somebody tries to root it in time. And by rooting it in time, I mean they start to find ways and means to bring the formless into form. That's where you get traditions from. Spiritual traditions, esoteric traditions. Right? That's where you get the forms. That's where you get the Zen bowing and the ritualized chanting and the ritualized eating and the ritualized everything. You go into a Zen temple, I mean, everything's ritualized. I mean, if you go into a Zen monastery, you walk into the bathroom and you'll find a little chant that you chant when you sit down on the john. And you'll find the chant you chant when you wash your hands, and you'll find the chant that you chant when you dry your hands, and you'll find the chant that you chant when you leave. And everything is ritualized. So this and all of that is an attempt to bring the formless into form. Not to lock it into form, not to confine it into form, but to make it available. It's a doorway, right? It's a doorway into the infinite. That's what all this traditional stuff is. It's somebody trying to bring the infinite and root it into this world. I'm very well aware through direct experience that everything is already that, and I'm very well that it's already one, and it's already the infinite, and I know all that, but that's why I said, don't listen to this as if it's something you're trying to understand, because it's not understand. It doesn't make sense. Even if you hold on to any philosophy, dualistic or non-dualistic, what I'm saying doesn't make sense. And the reason is truth doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. Not to the mind, not to any philosophy, not to any ideology. It goes right past them all. In the same way that I said to my teacher, this is bigger than Zen. If I was something else, if I was into Advaita, I would have said this is beyond Advaita. If I was into some non-dual philosophy, which I wasn't, I never heard of the stuff, I would have said, this is beyond non-dual philosophy. And I'm sure she would have shook her head and went like, that's the whole point. Right? But that moment of that's the whole point, that was an initiation, and that was an acknowledgement into a totally different lineage of truth. It was not a lineage that was rooted in time. So there's lineage that is rooted, many lineages that are rooted in time, and then there are lineage that is not rooted in time. The lineage that does not rooted in time, there is no beginning to it. There is no founder to it. You cannot put a face on it. It didn't begin 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or 20 minutes ago. It has no beginning to it. It has no end to it. And it has no face to it. Because it's not rooted in time. It's not rooted, can we say? It's not, there's no attempt to root it into the world of illusion. Because that's what traditions are. They're trying to root truth into the world of illusion. So you have a doorway.